Great. Okay, so let's go ahead. So again, today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Division of Global Affairs Europe Cuba and KSU's Bagwell Center for the Study of Markets and Economic Opportunity. Our guest speaker today is Dr. Archibald Ritter. He is a distinguished research professor in the Department of Economics at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. He has a BA in Economics from Queen's University, an MA in Economics from the University of Western Ontario, and a PhD in Economics from the University of Texas. He is an expert in development economics with particular expertise on issues related to Africa and Latin America. He's written multiple books, most recently African Economic Development, Entrepreneurial Cuba, The Changing Policy Landscape, and The Cuban Economy. His academic research has been published in journals such as Latin American Research Review, Canadian Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Studies, Canadian Journal of Development Studies, and Social and Economic Studies. Today he will be giving a talk titled Public and Private, Market and Plan, Some Lessons from Cuba and the United States. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ritter to Kennesaw State.
Thank you very much indeed for being here. I'm happy to be visiting Georgia again, except that they're working pretty hard. And I hope I'll try and keep you awake anyway for the next hour and 15 minutes. I decided I should change that title a little bit. That seems on second thought to be a little bit arrogant and maybe too ambitious. So I'm not going to talk about lessons for Cuba and United States, maybe observations for Cuba and United States. But I'm going to be focusing on the market mechanism vis-a-vis planning and the public sector vis-a-vis the private sector. This is the agenda. I'm going to give it an overview of the market mechanism, its history, how it works, strengths and weaknesses, likewise with the public sector, public planning. A few words on the development roles of non-governmental organizations. That's sort of the third type of economic institution in our economy, non-government, non-market private, but not-for-profit, non-governmental organizations. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about successes and failures in the U.S. mixed market economy. And here I'm probably going to make some enemies, maybe not, I don't know. Then I'm going to talk about failure and success in the Cuban economy and then draw a few conclusions from all of that. But before I start, I wonder if I could just ask you, how many of you are economics majors? Oh, congratulations. How many of you have taken first-year economics? Most of you, eh? How many of you are development studies? Where are the rest of you from?
Marketing.
Pardon me? Marketing? And other areas? Okay, good. Well, let me proceed then. The argument I'm going to make is that markets on the one hand and planning on the other hand, or private and public sectors, both have advantages and disadvantages. Both are absolutely necessary for the reasonable functioning of an economy. Cuba has made some crazy big mistakes in the functioning of its economy, but it has one and maybe a couple of other successes. And I'm going to say a few words about that successful area. United States has incredible achievements in many areas of the economy. It has two weaknesses, as I see it at this time, two major problems. And the conclusion I'm going to come to is basically that we have an eternal task. We have lots of eternal tasks. The sustainability of our environment is the big one right now. But another eternal task is to find the optimum combination of the market mechanism and planning, or the public and private sectors, for human well-being. And every country faces those dilemmas. Those are the substance of our political debates. Those are going to be huge issues for you in 2 years. They were big issues for us in Canada. until, well, right now, of course, we've sort of resolved them a little bit with an election that we had on Monday. So first, the market mechanism. Those of you who have taken first-year economics will know lots about the market mechanism, and I'll say a bit about that, but just a bit of background. Markets have existed since time immemorial, pretty much. They have been independently invented everywhere, pretty much. They exist in old civilizations long before the contact with the West. They have major roles or they had major roles, I should say, in the centrally planned economies of Eastern Europe. However, the emergence of market-oriented societies where the market sort of determines much of what goes on and much of the structure of the society, that's a newer phenomena in the last 100 years. But let me start with just a very quick historical view in a couple of slides of markets. These are some of the markets of Phoenicia. Phoenicia is where Lebanon is now. 800 years before the Roman Empire, they traded, they had markets locally, internationally. These are some of their international markets that the Phoenicians cultivated long before the Romans. Quite incredible. They don't get that much attention. This is the Roman Empire and its trading routes. It had a market economy. Well, that's not true. It had markets and trade, maybe not a market economy, covering this whole area around the Mediterranean, right up to Scotland there in England. They could never capture the Scots, eh? That was a major case, a major market-oriented society. Here's medieval Europe and Asia. There were trading routes throughout the region and into North Africa. Here are Indian trade routes in the United States and Canada. Markets existed before the coming of the Europeans in this continent and throughout Latin America down to the Inca Empire, but maybe not including the Inca Empire. This is a painting of what Diego Rivera thought the market in Mexico would have looked like just before the conquest by the Spaniards. Complicated type of market. This is another picture of the same thing, which I had to include because that is Malinche. Malinche was the traitorous mistress of Cortez, who then captured Mexico. This is a picture of a market a couple of years ago in Otavalo, Ecuador. Markets exist like that across Latin America. Here's a market in Africa, markets like that, and much more sophisticated than that. This is a low-income market, exist across Africa. So markets are everywhere, pretty much. They play vital roles. They were independently invented everywhere, and they're part of the reality of every society. Well, what do markets do? You've studied this in first-year economics. So you know this very well, and you study resource allocation and how markets determine what is produced, how it's produced, who gets to produce it, and for whom it's produced. And it's your demands in the market that determine ultimately what funny things get produced, like these jeans with holes in the knees. That's market demand that determines that those things get produced somewhere. Markets are communication systems. Markets communicate the demands of everybody, to producers. They communicate the decisions of producers to consumers, and they generate a major orchestration system in which the decisions of innumerable consumers are met by innumerable producers. Think of the coffee market. In the coffee market, there are probably a couple of 100,000, or maybe certainly tens, probably a couple of hundred, probably around 10 million producers of coffee in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and in countries in the northern hemisphere, like Vietnam. Well, their production decisions meet our demands for coffee through a complex set of markets in which there are big actors, small actors. It is a huge part of the international economy. Think of petroleum, for example. So markets orchestrate all of these activities and demands. Markets are incentive systems. It's the prices determined in markets that provide the incentive and the motivation for producers to produce coffee or tea or whatever. If the price falls, the incentive is weakened. Some producers drop out of the market. So that's another major function of markets. Then the final one I would mention here, markets can serve as mechanisms for the social control of economic activity. What do I mean by that? Well, Adam Smith talked about the invisible hand of the market. In competitive markets, such that prices would be pushed to the minimum, exploitation of consumers by producers or vice versa would not occur, but in competitive markets, the economic activities of producers would be under some sort of social control. That requires competitive markets, of course. If they aren't competitive, you can have exploitation of various kinds, cheating, and so on. Well, markets have some great advantages. There is no office tower in the world that is organizing these tens of millions of coffee producers and the billions of coffee drinkers. That is all done spontaneously and automatically through a range of markets. Consumer sovereignty is permitted by markets. It's our demands in the market that determine what gets produced. If the demand falls off, it doesn't get produced. So that's so-called consumer sovereignty. The consumer is supposed to be king. This decentralizes economic activities. It encourages self-activation. There's nobody telling the coffee farmers throughout the world that they have to go and produce coffee. They do it voluntarily because they need income, they need to survive. And producing coffee and probably products for their own consumption, that's the best way for them to do it. So markets permit and encourage self-activation, which is a great thing. It also enforces economic discipline. Enterprises have to look after their resources carefully. They have to try and produce efficiently because of the limits put on the prices of their products through the market. Another good thing about markets is that lots of types of enterprises can operate there. You can have capitalistic types of enterprises, privately owned enterprises. You can have cooperatives. You can have state enterprises. Big enterprises, little enterprises, they can all coexist and operate through markets. And then markets make possible, this is a big thing in Canada and the United States, socio-cultural pluralism. So different groups of people in a society can, through their demand, can get what they want to consume. Whether that's, vaping stuff or particular types of clothing or various kinds of music and so on. Markets permit all of those different communities to be served with their different types of demands. Having said all that, markets have weaknesses. Markets fail. Markets generate external costs and benefits. What's an external costs? Well, if an enterprise dumps its pollution into the environment, that is a cost. Now, two big environmental costs that we're thinking about right now are carbon dioxide and the dumping of carbon dioxide into the Earth's atmosphere by all of us. I did it when I came down here by plane from Canada. You did it if you came here by car. We dumped carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and the way it looks now, that's going it could make in 150 years, 200 years or less, it could make the planet uninhabitable. So we're all generating external costs. We do that when we dump plastics into the landfills and the oceans as well. So those are two types of external costs, and the market mechanism lets us do that. It doesn't control that in any way. The market mechanism doesn't produce public goods. We need law and order. We need a judicial system. We need the Federal Aeronautical the FAA. We need the FDA, for example. Markets don't produce the regulatory environment which they need in order to work. They may produce undesirable results in terms of social objectives. For example, health. If poor people can't get access to health, then they die young and unnecessarily. So the market mechanism will not ensure that people get access to health. And then finally, income distribution under the market mechanism has been bad historically and is getting much worse, I am sorry to say. There are other market failures. One of these is the tendency towards monopoly, which can be highly exploitive of consumers. Markets can be perverted by cheating, fraud, market manipulation, and so on. So markets have great strengths. They also have weaknesses. We absolutely need them. In order to have functioning markets, we have to have strong and effective government, surprisingly. Or maybe not surprisingly. We need law and order, personal security, an independent judicial system. We need contracts to be enforced. We need public goods, including all types of infrastructure. We need social policies and a social safety net. And if the market mechanism is to work, we need competition. Who can maintain competition? Well, governments can try. They're not doing a very good job anywhere, in my view. We also need other things for markets to work effectively. We need some energies focused on the common well-being. So we need people who are altruistic politicians. We need altruistic public action of various sorts. We need trust. We need people to trust each other. And we need honesty and non-corruption in all areas of the society, private enterprises and government too, of course. So the conclusion, which I just mentioned before, markets are absolutely vital. They have strengths, they have weaknesses, advantages and disadvantages. We need to get the maximum benefits from the market mechanism and reduce the disadvantages. Well, switching to the state, governments, public planning. Here I would say public planning has existed forever, not quite, for millennia. It has been used everywhere in the world. Every society, every complex society has had some sort of public planning. And as mentioned earlier, we need effective governments in order for markets to work reasonably well. Having said that, there was something that you don't need to worry about, but in the post-war era, there was something called development planning, which was the governments taking a very heavy hand in the planning of their societies, not quite Soviet style, but a heavy hand. This was popular for quite a while. It has been de-emphasized. It generated excessive expectations. The results were not that good. So we've backed away from what was called development planning. We backed away from that a bit. Well, a couple of pictures of public planning. Anybody seen Stonehenge? Hope you get a chance to go there sometime. That was built 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. The Celtic peoples moved those stones immense distances from a quarry in Wales to southern England and built this religious site. This is Tenochtitlan. This was Mexico City as Cortez found it. Perhaps. This is an artist's impression. It might not have been quite like that, but it was certainly a sophisticated thing. You can see the incredible urban planning, the strong role of some sort of state that is involved in that. Here is Teotihuacan, also just outside of Mexico. This is how you see this today. This is a city that goes back about 1,500 years before the picture that I just showed you. This is really old. This is from around the birth of Christ. But the Mexican Indians at this time produced this incredible ceremonial city. And in fact, you could go throughout Mexico into the Maya world, the Aztec world, and find incredible urban centers like this, which involve just amazing urban planning, strong governments. And the pyramids, you all know about them. Don't like the way they were built, but lots of planning went into it. The Great Wall of China, incredible planning by the Chinese government a long time ago. Here's one. Europe is littered with cathedrals like this, built 1,000 years ago, some of them. So huge amounts of planning went into those as well. So planning has occurred virtually everywhere. In fact, everywhere, I would say, wherever there are more complex societies evolving. Well, the role of the state. What do governments do? What do they have to do? Well, governments are necessary, governments at various levels, in various types of social structures, but everywhere in the world, they're necessary for the maintenance of a basic civilized order. Law and order, personal security are vital. Governments are necessary to produce public goods, to adjust for the external costs that we impose on the environment or other people, and external benefits. Environmental protection is now one of the biggest of all of these. Governments are necessary for improving income distribution, which can be quite disastrous in their absence. And then governments are necessary for providing the regulatory framework within which markets operate. So I mentioned the FAA, the Federal Aeronautics Administration. Obviously, that plays a vital role in ensuring the organization and safety of air travel in the United States. The FDA does the same thing for food and drugs. So governments in complex societies now have to play a huge role providing this regulatory superstructure. Well, governments can have strengths, they can have weaknesses. One of the greatest strengths is that governments maybe, hopefully, provide or represent the common well-being of the society. We don't expect, or I don't expect, General Motors or Facebook or whatever, I don't expect any private enterprise to look after the well-being of my country or your country. We expect governments to do that. Governments at all levels, neighborhood associations, municipal, county, state, and federal, and the United Nations. So governments may represent the common well-being. There are no alternatives to governments of various sorts in any complex society. Governments have the capability of improving equity, improving social justice in ways that markets can't conceivably undertake. Governments can then generate macro flexibility. What is macro flexibility? Well, macro flexibility means shifting resources in a crisis situation in a major way. Think of World War II. Governments, the US government, Canadian, other governments were able to shift resources very quickly and effectively in a matter of a couple of years to the war effort. Well, that could be done for anything that we really agreed upon. The Eisenhower system of interstate highways, for example, is another example. However, government and the public sector has weaknesses. One weakness is that governments may not serve for the well-being of their community. Governments may not be benevolent. They may not be altruistic. They may be corrupt. They may be fraudulent. They may be kleptocratic. That means that the focus is on theft and stealing. Governments may be captured by particular classes. Historically, that's been the case very often. They may be captured by some regions of a country against other regions. They may be captured by tribes, ethnic groups. They may be captured by the rich, the vested interests of various sorts. So that there's no guarantee that governments actually do represent the common well-being. That's something we have to ensure that happens. There are other problems which I'll go maybe sort of quickly over. Governments and also the private sector relies on bureaucracies to organize its activities. Well, bureaucracies are necessary, but they have some characteristics which make them a little bit problematic, so that they have to be watched and controlled and limited also. In a bureaucracy, incentive structures are deformed. There's no external price mechanism requiring bureaucracies to be efficient because they don't produce anything that is sold. So a bureaucracy can become lethargic, inefficient, sclerotic, intent on just looking after the well-being of the bureaucrats, forget the task that it's supposed to do, and so on. I'm going to skip number 4. Number 5, centrally determined preferences. Governments can impose what you and I consume, what you and I produce. Think of North Korea right now. You have a government in total control of the society, determining basically what people wear, what they eat, everything. Is there any variety among what people wear and what people choose to do, the music they hear and so on? No, not much, if any. That can be problematic. A highly centralized system can be one in which the bureaucrats at the center determine the kind of car produced, the food you eat, the clothing you wear, and so on. That is problematic because people know better what is best for them. Bureaucrats in office towers do not. Then there is the problem, I mentioned the benefits of macro flexibility here. Well, macro flexibility can be a bad thing because if governments decide to do stupid things and shift all their resources into doing one stupid thing, that can be a massive mistake for the society. And I'll mention Fidel Castro's massive mistakes. He decides on something because his gut tells him it's the thing to do. All the resources of the society get shifted in that direction. All the yes men and the sycophants in the court, basically all the newspapers say, yes, that's wonderful. They go at it and do some incredibly stupid thing. And I'll say just a few words about that later on. So macro flexibility can be a problem. Governments may lack the abilities to do certain things. Governments are as good as the people in them. Nobody is perfect in a government. To expect governments or government offices or bureaucracies to do too much may be ill-advised because it's people like you and me that are trying to make these bureaucracies function. So, to conclude, we absolutely have to have a public sector. The public sector provides very beneficial things. It has great strengths. It also has weaknesses. So the challenge is to overcome the problems. How? Well, that is a big question, which I let you deal with. And here, let me just mention the third group of economic activities, just very briefly, because I think they merit attention, but I'm not going to focus on them. And this is the role of NGOs, the not-for-profit sector, or the cooperative sector. They're all interrelated, these types of activities. We have innumerable non-governmental organizations, foundations of various sorts, trying to do good things for various communities in various ways. We have cooperatives, numerous cooperatives operating in every country. Well, not-for-profit activities in theory are wonderful because it's citizens voluntarily at all levels producing services or perhaps goods for people who need them. And they do that at their own initiative on a voluntary basis. That's a good thing. Cooperatives are one type of not-for-profit organization. And a cooperative is just an association of people organized formally or informally in order to meet some common objective through a jointly owned and a jointly managed enterprise. So a cooperative is people deciding that they are going to be the owners and the managers of their own little enterprise. Here's a cooperative, an informal cooperative, which existed across this continent some time ago. These are American cooperatives. You recognize some of these. Sorry, a couple of you have seen this already. But these are American cooperatives, and some of those are very well known. And I looked in Wikipedia under cooperative a little while ago and saw a listing of the cooperatives that exist in the United States. They are innumerable. Most of them are not workers' cooperatives in an enterprise. Most of the ones that I saw listed were cooperatives of entrepreneurs, of real retailers frequently, so that the retailers would establish a cooperative of retailers to do the mass purchasing, the advertising for the whole group. You have here a variety of types of cooperatives from the United States. Well, a good thing about cooperatives is that they can harness a variety of motives. Income generation is a desirable motive. People have to live, they have to earn incomes. But people want to do good things. They want to make the world a better place. So that's a motivation in NGOs as well. So that's important because people have complex motivations, and it's not all, money is not the only one. And in non-governmental organizations, they can let some of the other motivations function. Well, I'm going to skip the rest of this on NGOs, I think. They have strengths, they have weaknesses. They aren't any panacea at all. But let me now look at a couple of cases. And I'll start with the United States. The successes of the United States are well known to everybody here. United States has been, for 200 years perhaps, the dynamic leader of innovation and the economic development generally in the world. So many innovations have come out of the United States. It hardly needs emphasis. The success of the American economy is legendary over the last 2 centuries I've mentioned. Also, the United States has been the key architect and the defender of the international economic and political system. This system, established basically starting in 1946, which was really developed at the insistence of the United States, it has generated unparalleled prosperity for virtually all of the world since 1946. It has generated peace for the most part in that time period. That has been a remarkable achievement. the domestic and international success of the United States is overwhelming. Oh, and then I could mention culture. The cultural influence of the United States throughout the world is quite unbelievable. So that the American popular music, American art, architecture, and so on, it's had a huge international influence. But there are a couple of problems, problem areas where markets do not work. Markets have not generated a good solution. The current combination, I should say, of markets and governments have not generated a really good solution, where perhaps public action is needed, more public action. And these relate to income distribution and the medical system. Income distribution, let me just illustrate this a little bit. This line here shows the proportion of incomes generated over the years from 1980 to 2016 or so there. Notice that the share of the bottom 50% of the income receivers in the United States, their share has fallen from over 20% up there, steadily down to around, what's this? That's about maybe 13%. A steady reduction, and I'm sure my guess is that it might have fallen further in the last couple of years. I don't know. Here's a more shocking chart for me. This shows the income share of the top 1% of income receivers in the United States and the bottom 50%. 1980, notice the share of the bottom 50%, 22% of total income. The share of the top 1%, about 11% of national income. Look how those two lines have gone. The share of the top 1% rising steadily, almost doubling, not quite. The share of the bottom 50% declining. Well, is that an issue? Yes, it is. By the way, I don't know if you've been following the news, but in Chile, have you noticed, any of you follow Chile? That's a country where I once lived in South America. Chile has the best economy in Latin America. It has grown well. Poverty has been reduced in Chile more than anywhere else in the world, anywhere else in Latin America, pardon me. So poverty is low as they measure it. They've had peace and prosperity since 1990 with the overthrow of the Pinochet dictatorship. So that's what? That's 39 years, 28, 30. What has happened in the last 10 days is that Chilean citizens have sort of gone crazy. And there's been massive rioting. What sparked it was a 3% increase in the price of public transport. That put people out into the streets, demonstrating, rioting, burning buildings, and so on. That has become a really big thing. The president of Chile, in fact, eliminated that 3% increase. The rioting continued. Then the people who were rioting said, income distribution is too bad. That we've had all this economic growth. The poor may have gotten less poor. Poverty has been diminished. But the inequalities continue to be supreme, and we see the hyper-rich get richer and richer. And that's true. So despite the fact that poverty fell, income distribution in Chile is extreme and has been growing. And all of a sudden, the citizens have been rioting. In the last step, the president of Chile increased the minimum. I think he doubled the minimum wage. he increased the wages for civil servants, and he did other financial measures to benefit lower income groups. Today, they're still rioting. So that's an interesting thing. But at some point, when this sort of thing occurs, you need to start to worry. Here are some numbers which illustrate this phenomena a little more precisely, perhaps. This shows pre-tax income and after-tax income in these two periods of time, 1946 to 80, 1980 to 2014. By the way, all of these numbers come from this particular source here, which are generated by the World Income Distribution Organization. If you want to get the raw numbers for all of this and income distribution numbers for all of the world, go to or Google World Income Distribution, and you'll come to this site. So that's something that's interesting to do. But take a look at some of these numbers. Before tax, pre-tax income. Look at the bottom 20% in this time period. The bottom 20% had a major increase in its incomes, 109%. Then what happened in 1980 to 2014? A reduction. Lower income groups have been getting poorer in terms of pre-tax incomes. Then go down to the top 0.1% or the 0.001%. You find increases from 46 to 80 here, substantial increases. Then in this period of time, massive increases. Then taxation limits those inequalities to some extent. But let's just look at that for a second. In terms of after-tax income, the bottom 20% in this period of time had an increase in income of 179%. But in this period of time, and I would say right up to the present, the increase is 4%. So the bottom 20% has been getting better off, but not very much in this time period. Then go to the top 10% or the top 0.01 or 0.001 or whatever. And again, you'll find that the highest income groups are, even after tax, are getting huge increases in income over this time period, an over 600% increase in income. Wow, compared to 4% for the bottom 20%. Yes?
You have similar data for Cuba?
I wish, no. No. In Cuba, the picture, I'll talk about that later, okay? So that is what the market mechanism is doing. The market mechanism is producing this type of income distribution as exemplified by these numbers. The government sector through taxation is maybe adjusting some of those figures a little bit, but not by a whole lot. Now there's one thing missing from this table, I must say, and that's government expenditures on things like education and health. Because the poor do get health coverage in the United States. Everybody should get education provided by the state. So those are types of income. Those would make the numbers look a little less dire. It'd look better if we could have after tax and after government expenditure income. So this exaggerates the numbers, the true numbers, to a substantial extent, I would say. But the market-generated income distribution is this one here. Oh, then we look at tax rates. The average tax rate in the United States from 1913 to 2013 has risen steadily. That's the average tax rate for everybody is this line in black. The average tax rate for the top 1% has jumped up and down. It increased in wartime, It has generally sort of, if anything, tended downwards, Then you look at the average tax rate for the bottom 50% here. The average tax rate for them has risen fairly steadily. This sort of illustrates what Warren Buffett once said. Warren Buffett pointed out some years ago that his average tax rate was less than that of his secretary. Whoa, whoa, incredible. Warren Buffett, one of the richest people in the world, vis-a-vis his secretary. So the taxation system changes the picture to some extent, but it's problematic too. This is a chart that just came out of The Economist magazine 2 weeks ago, and it shows the decades since 1960 in which a county has been classified officially by US measurements as being poor. So you can see where the basic poverty is. It's in the southern part of the United States, a little bit in the prairies here, South Dakota, and elsewhere, but it is spread across the country. And hey, we've been aware of this since the 1960s. That's an intractable problem. We have not been able to deal with it. And I don't want to be boastful or anything. It's virtually as bad in Canada, okay? In a lot of European countries would be in a better situation, but it's problematic. So, is this a problem? That's for the voters of the United States to decide on. What can be done about it? Why does it exist? Why does this poverty exist? Why did income distribution improve from 1946 to 1980? Well, I think because the pattern of growth in that period of time generated lots of jobs. More and more people from lower income agricultural areas in the south were incorporated into higher income jobs in the north, for example. Southern people going up to work on the cars in Detroit, just as one example. So we had in most countries, including my country, what you could call automatic inclusive economic growth, so that people shared normally in the economic growth of the country. That's maybe the biggest factor. Also, we had activist governments throughout much of that period, which in many countries redistributed income through the tax system and through public expenditures of various sorts. What has happened in the last 40 years, since 1980, two basic factors, I would say. One is automation and the replacement of workers by machines, robotics and all of that, so that sort of middle income jobs have been more difficult to generate. And the Rust Belt phenomena. The United States, in fact, Cuba, as we'll see, much of Europe, Canada, we have a whole, and Africa too. They have Rust Belt areas in many of their cities. Why? China. China is such an effective producer, a low-cost producer of many goods and services, that they have flooded the international market, including the United States and Canada, with low-cost products with which we can't compete. Is that beneficial? Well, consumers think so, because consumer sovereignty, that your decisions, my decisions, we go and buy the lowest cost stuff in Costco or Home Depot or Walmart or wherever. Try and find, I looked for something made in Canada in Walmart one time. I couldn't find it. Eventually I found they were selling water somewhere that was Canadian water. But virtually everything else was from somewhere else, and principally China. That has happened throughout the world. That's happened in your Rust Belt and our Rust Belt. That has eliminated a lot of sort of middle income jobs. So I think that's a factor too. So despite the fact that the United States has historically low unemployment right now, income distribution still continues to be problematic. What can be done about it? Well, I can't tell you. You got to figure that out, and you've got the next election to think about it. It's obviously a central political issue in every country, how to deal with income distribution. Different political parties have different ideas. Some parties may be in denial in my country as well as yours. Others want to focus on it, but it's a big issue. Okay, the second issue is medicine or health. And here the news is not good either. In this case, let me say, I have a son and a daughter-in-law who are doctors in Portland, Oregon. So I feel very complicated emotions when I talk about the American medical system, because they're in it. They're doing all right as doctors. But when you look at the basic data on the health system, there's some things of interest. Look at this. This is health expenditure as a percentage of GDP. Here is United States at the top. 17.2% of GDP, of the total value of goods and services produced in the country, goes to medicine. That was in 2017. That may be close to 18% now. That is much higher than all other countries. Where's Canada? I can't find, there's Canada there, 10%. Spain, 8%. So United States spends more as a proportion of GDP on medicine than any country in the world. Certainly a good deal more than any of the high-income countries. Then if you look at dollar expenditures per person, look at this. United States here spends about $9,000 per person per year on medicine. That's much higher than all the other countries. Canada is this one down here. The average for the OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. That's a sort of a club of high-income countries. Their average is this thing, which is at about, 13% or something. So United States spends more than any country in the world on a per capita basis. Interestingly enough, the pink is private, the blue is public. So you do have a large public healthcare system, for veterans, for old folks, for the poor. The government provides a lot of medical assistance plus public health measures. So you already have a mixed system, and it looks as though almost half of your medical system is provided through government auspices and half through markets. But the market share for United States is a good deal higher than virtually every other country there. Here is a shocker of a chart for me. In theory, markets are not supposed to involve huge bureaucracies. In fact, the medical system in the United States is bureaucracy heavy. Why? Because every giant medical care insurance company and the medicine corporations have huge bureaucracies, all trying to minimize their outpayments to the patients. Sorry, I'm being nasty there. But look at this. The administrative costs in the United States as a percentage of total healthcare expenditures are higher in the United States than all of these countries. So this is a higher number of a larger percentage on total health expenditures. So the system in the United States is bureaucracy heavy. Oh my gosh, I've got to speed up here, sorry. I am sorry to say, the United States has the best system in the world and also maybe the least cost-effective system. It's the best system if you can afford it. If you can afford the private medicine that you need, you can get the very best specialized medical attention that you need. However, look at the one important measure of health well-being, health outcomes, life expectancy at birth. And look at the numbers here. United States is way down here. It has, despite its high medical expenses, it has a lower level of life expectancy than all of these other countries. Even Chile, which is hard for me to believe, given the poverty that existed, the income maldistribution in Chile, they seem to get a better result than the United States in terms of life expectancy. Here's another chart. I don't know if you've seen this kind of thing before. This shows infant mortality. That's the death of children before the age of 1. And look at the numbers here, the number of infant deaths per 1,000 live births. You go down this list, and here is United States. United States should be at the top of the list with its medical expenditures. In fact, it's way down here. That's shocking. Well, the question, can the effectiveness of the medical system be improved? Well, once again, that's one of your big issues for you to figure out in the next election. And there are all sorts of different views being put forth in that area. But what it will require is some sort of rethinking of the mix of public sector, public role, government expenditure, and private sector market-oriented expenditure. And my guess is that you're going to need more public sector intervention to get health care to the bottom income receivers whose health suffers the most. Okay, let me move to Cuba. And the two lessons there are, first, how do you produce a highly dysfunctional economy, an economy that doesn't work? And then secondly, despite all that, how do you produce a surprisingly good health system? I was going to no, I'll skip that. If you look at a variety of indicators in Cuba of its economic performance in the last while, the picture looks disastrous. For example, here's an estimate made by Cuban economists of real income, that's inflation-adjusted income in Cuba, from 1989 to 2005. You can see a disastrous decline in real income during the period of time when the Soviet Union cut its subsidization. A steady increase, that increase continues to the present, but it's still very low. So incomes fell, they have not recovered. Here's some information on manufacturing output. Again, you can see a collapse after 1990, is that? Some increase, steady increase, but it still is nowhere near where it started. Sugar production. Sugar used to be the big product of Cuba. It was the #1 producer in the world. Its harvests were up in here around 7 to 8 million tons of sugar per year. That collapsed in 1990 when the economy went into a tailspin. It has struggled since then and is in the area of 1.1 million tons today, very low. And I'll skip that one. Here is a chart that is rather damning. What this one shows is exports of food in the gray lines, 1990, 1989, through to 2011, and the importation of other foods. Well, you can see a huge decline in the export of food. That includes sugar, but also other foods, vegetables, oranges in particular, while at the same time, food imports have been increasing. The agricultural system has not been functioning in Cuba. Obviously, there's a big problem there. What has generated the collapse in Cuba? It's been a variety of things. It's been a conjuncture of circumstances. Central planning was a big factor in this. Too much role for the state, trying to do too much that it couldn't do. And the result of that were all the problems of bureaucracy, problems of information flows flowing up to the system, so that Fidel never really had a good idea of what was going on the ground, because all of the layers in the bureaucracy would massage the information, make themselves look better, so that by the time the information got to Fidel, it was deformed seriously. One thing I'd like to mention is Castro's interference. Castro tried to micromanage the economy. He would wander around the country, visiting factories here and there, farms here and there, hear their problems, and give them a solution. Well, maybe some of those solutions were good, but it's hard to understand the depth of the problem in a context in one meeting. So a lot of the advice he gave was really dumb. In fact, the Cubans have a joke for that. And the joke was that Fidel goes to a state farm, speaks to the manager. The manager says, "Oh, we don't know what to do. All our chickens are dying. They're not laying eggs." So Fidel pulls on his beard and says, "Feed the chickens more salt." Okay, then Fidel goes away. He comes back a year later, and he speaks to the manager. "Well, how are the chickens doing? Are they laying well?" And the manager says, "No, they're continuing to die. The egg production has fallen even further." So Fidel pulls on his beard, thinks hard, and says, "Feed the chickens more pepper." So he goes away. He comes back a year later, speaks to the manager, and asks the manager, "Oh, how are the chickens doing now?" And the manager says, "We don't know what to do. All of the chickens have died." So Fidel pulls on his beard and says, "Such a tragedy, and I have so many more good ideas." But at any rate, Fidel interferes, micromanaged, that did not help, but he also made massive policy errors. His gut told him, for example, that Cuba should produce 10 million tons of sugar by 1970. His gut told him that they should achieve instant industrialization by 1973. That was the first strategy. His gut told him later on, about 2008, I think it was, that they needed to cut sugar production by half, shut half the sugar mills because they weren't profitable. So a highly centralized system makes macro flexibility very perverse because there were no checks on Castro. Once he decided to do something, all of the society, the press, the sycophants, and everybody had to follow along behind him. So that was a big contributor to Cuba's problems. The termination of the special relationship with Russia was a big factor leading to a crisis in 1993. That led to an economic meltdown. But more than that, when Cuba emerged from this, they found that they had a capital stock which was obsolete, which was antiquated, it was uncompetitive. They had a capital stock that was Soviet from Russia or Czechoslovakian, which could not compete with the technologies that had evolved in Western Europe, Japan, Korea, South Korea, and the United States. So that was a factor. Another factor was inadequate maintenance and low levels of investment. Cuba has had a rate of investment of around 10% for a long, long time, and it's still in the area of 10%. That is far less than you need for the replacement of the capital stock. Then they've had monetary screw-ups as well, and let me skip that. Most recently, they've lost their second sugar daddy, which was Venezuela. China, as I mentioned, has helped to deindustrialize Cuba. China emerged as a superpower in manufacturing with an undervalued exchange rate for a lot of the time. Cuba, on the other hand, had an overvalued exchange rate with an antiquated capital stock, and the result was that Cuba became flooded with Chinese stuff. This is a map of where Walmart gets its stuff, okay, a couple of years ago. Most of it from China, some from the United States, and this is Walmart USA. You can see the massive role of China. My guess, and I wish I could see the numbers, my guess is that for Cuba it would be somewhat similar, except the United States would not be there. For Cuba, China is just a predominating economic presence at this time. Well, does Cuba have an economic future, a reasonable economic future? It's got lots of advantages. Educated people, that's a key one. It's got lots of disadvantages. I would say yes, it has a general economic future, but only if effective markets can be introduced. Cuba has made steps in that direction, but it has a long way to go. Other things it has to do are mentioned here. It needs to increase investment. It needs a unified exchange rate. And now I've just been told it's got 3 currencies. It had 2 for a while. It's got a third, which is, they're back to the US dollar. So they have the old peso, the new peso, which was a substitute for the dollar, and the US dollar is being accepted now as a currency in Cuba. Very bizarre. And ultimately, I hope that it will be possible for Cuba to reintegrate with the United States, which is its natural geo-economic partner. So those are all going to be necessary. Well, let me look at health very quickly. I've got about 2 minutes to do that. Cuba has good health indicators, and this is a little bit surprising. Look, life expectancy for Cuba exceeds that of the United States. Infant mortality is lower. Child mortality, under 5 mortality, is lower. But look at the incomes. Cuba's income is tiny compared to that of the United States. Its education system, Cuba's education system is significant in terms of years of schooling compared to the United States. Then if you look at these human security indicators, homicide rates, Cuba is not good. If you look at the suicide rate for men and women in the United States and Cuba, Cuba is not good. You look at prison population per 100,000 people, Cuba is almost second only to the United States in the Western Hemisphere. So Cuba's health and security indicators, the health indicators are very good, security indicators not so good. Whoa, what did I do here? Oops. Oh yeah, here's the last chart I want to show you. This little chart shows on the horizontal axis per capita health spending, okay? And on this axis, it has life expectancy, the expected years of life. Look at Cuba here. Cuba has an income per capita here. This is obviously not as accurate as it should be. A very low income per capita, but a relatively high life expectancy. United States has a high health spending per capita in this range with a level of life expectancy about the same as Cuba. So, which is the one that's getting the biggest bang for its buck? Obviously, it's Cuba. They're doing well with nothing, or almost nothing. How are they doing that? Well, they started with a strong medical system in 1950 that doesn't get that much attention. Perhaps the big thing is that they have universal coverage. Everybody has coverage, varying degrees of effectiveness, but everybody does get medical coverage of some sort. This has been a high policy, a priority area for the government. The government has focused on this. This has been Fidel Castro's number one concern. And another thing I would mention is low pay for doctors. Doctors get paid so low, so little in Cuba. They are anxious to emigrate if they can. They have to supplement their official incomes with small enterprise activities, hustling, driving their cars as taxis, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, you could say that the doctors and the medical personnel are subsidizing the Cuba's health system, making it cost less than it really should. Okay, the main conclusions. as I started out. Markets and planning, public and private sectors are both absolutely vital for any society. Both have advantages and disadvantages, strengths and weaknesses. Somehow, we have to compatibilize those, or we have to obtain optimum combinations for the different parts of the functioning of our societies. Well, revolutionary Cuba, massive central economic mistakes, but one success in health. United States, great achievements in many areas, economic areas, unbelievable achievements, but current problems in health and income distribution. Resolving these is difficult. Think of the problems that United States is going to have in the next few years trying to figure out what to do and how to do it and actually implement policies in the area of health. That's going to be very difficult. Cuba, it's the problems it faces, trying to get its economy back on track. Those are overwhelming, those are incredible, and I wish it good luck. Well, the task of United States and Cuba and every other country is to try and figure out the best combination of the public sector and the private sector, the market mechanism, and state government operation to achieve optimum benefits for people. My last recommendation: forget the big terms socialism and capitalism. I tried not to use either of those in this, but I used capitalism once. I don't like those terms. Those have become terms of abuse. They are substitutes for clear thinking. If you don't like someone, you call them a capitalist or a socialist. They just mess up the analysis. Focus instead on pragmatically on how to get the best out of both markets and the state sector. Solve the problems pragmatically. Well, that's easy to say. That is really, really hard to do. So I wish you good luck. I wish Cuba good luck. So thank you very much.